this time, we're going to have the three of us sitting at the table, and I've got my timer. We'll take about 15 minutes of some back and forth between Matt McCormick and Mike Licona, and then we'll open things up to the rest of the audience, and we'll finish up by 6 o'clock. I guess I can sit in the middle, but I don't really have to.
You should.
Okay. I'm like the live wire that conducts the electricity. No, the possible format here is just to open things up to Mike or Matt. Can you guys hear me okay? And let me start off by asking each of them if they'd like to ask the other one sort of an opening question or make an opening comment. And again, I'm going to keep my eye on the clock. You want to start?
Yeah, sure. All right, Matt. One thing you talked about was, let's see, because I got a bunch of things written down here. All right, you're talking about like near-death experiences. There are numerous naturalistic explanations like drugs. But what do you do with the 300 or so cases where the person is certifiably dead, and while dead, they claim to come out of the body, and they're able to report accurate information they could not have known otherwise? How do you explain this?
Well, while it's not directly to the question about the resurrection, it's sort of real pertinent to the background information here. Well, my first question, I have lots of questions for these kinds of cases. I know that many people have asserted, like you have, that folks who are, well, let's make some distinctions. I talked about cardiopulmonary dead. I think when somebody's cardiopulmonary dead, explaining how it is that that person who was unconscious on the table then is able to come back and say something about events that transpired during that period, easy. Not difficult at all, it's quite common, right? Somebody who's unconscious on the table, just like when you're having a dream at night, they've heard the doctors, overheard the doctors talking, they've seen people around the room and the like. And I'm not prepared to accept that these people, I mean, I guess it depends on the case. I want to hear about the case.
Well, statistics show that when your heart has stopped working for at least 30 seconds, the brain's not working either. So if there's no
I
brain...
I just flatly disagree with that. That's just not right.
I mean, that's not current research, okay? So if the brain's not working after 30 seconds, after the heart's not, how are they thinking? How are they hearing?
Okay, so there's roughly 83 billion neurons in the brain with 5 to 50,000 dendritic connections each. And the metabolic processes of the neural cells depend in part upon the presence of glucose and oxygenated blood. And if you've got somebody on CPR, if you've got them on a respirator, and if we're keeping blood flow going to the brain, it's simply not the case. We don't have any reason to think that their brains have stopped working. Now, if the neural cells have ceased to function completely, brain cell death happens in a matter of minutes. Certainly complete. I've made a joke about this in previous discussions.
Hang on a second, Matt, because we do have limited time. So let me say this. Let's just suppose that you're on the table, and let's say you've got some residual brain activity like you're suggesting. Okay, I wouldn't grant that, but I'll grant it for now. How do you explain how she's able to go home and go through the rooms and explain what her family members were wearing, what they were doing, what song they were singing, what her mom was making for dinner when she was dead at the time?
Well, this first I've ever heard of this story. It's you telling an anecdote. I don't know whether, in fact, she did any of that. I don't know if I have or you have good reason to think that all of that happened.
Okay, if it
don't know about the details.
If it did, does that cause problems with naturalism in your view?
I don't know about naturalism. Here's what would be a really interesting case. If we had a case of someone for whom all metabolic activity in their brains had ceased, and we could establish somehow during that period that some conscious event had happened, any sort of conscious event.
We got those Reynolds,
where all 83 billion neurons have ceased their metabolic functions, and then we bring them back. And I've coined a term, I call this McCormick dead. We don't have cases like this, because once that happens, those cells don't get revived, they don't come back, they don't recover from that kind of deprivation. In order to stop the metabolic function of the cell in those kinds of cases,
Right. All right,
you irreparably damage it.
The one that
But
I
if
gave
we
you
can
is
have
crystal
cases
Merzlock, okay?
If we can have a case like that, where somebody was having some sort of conscious experience and we could corroborate it,
Came down to
while their brain was completely, utterly McCormick dead, that'd be really interesting.
But let's say she wasn't McCormick dead, okay? And she's still, while she's got no heartbeat, no brain activity, she comes
Well, that's, I'm
out.
just
Okay.
denying that.
No, nothing on the EKG or the EEG. So she comes out of her body, she says, and she goes to her house and she's able to report all these things that happen. And the physicians and the hospital, the attending physician corroborated. So if the story I gave with Crystal Merzlock is true, what does that do for atheism?
I don't know what it does for atheism. I'm not making an argument for atheism.
Let's rotate then, because
Yeah.
we're 5 minutes into our 15, and I want to give Matt a chance to ask a question from a different part of the discussion
Okay.
to mine.
Well, I'll just repeat the question that I asked at the end. And I'd love to hear from folks in the audience too. Why didn't we get better evidence for Jesus? Surely it could have been better than it is.
Yeah, I think it could have been better. The question, though, is it sufficient? And if a financial planner came to me and said, hey, Mike, I'd like you to invest $2,000 this year in an IRA with me. And let's say, all right, I'll do it, your friend. And he does, and he puts it in penny stocks, and I lose 75%. The next year he comes back to me and he says, hey, thanks for giving me that $2,000. Now I want you to roll all your IRAs and 401ks and put them with me and let me manage it. I say, no way, pal. You couldn't even handle right what I did give you. Could it be that maybe God says, you know what, I'm giving you sufficient evidence, and what I've given, you haven't handled it properly. You haven't accounted for the evidence, the historical evidence. You can't account for the supernatural. You can't account for design. Why should I give you more?
So who messed up? Was it these people in first century Palestine? They're the ones who messed up? Or we're messing up because the evidence is present to us, but we're not acknowledging it?
I don't think they messed up. I think the evidence we have is good.
No, I'm asking about your metaphor concerning an investment banker. You said
I'm saying, what if God says to you, hey, Matt, I've already entrusted some good evidence to you, and look what you've done with it.
Okay, so the point is that the reason the evidence for Jesus isn't better, it's our fault?
I'm saying, hey, if you can't even handle what he has given, he's under no obligation to give you more.
That seems
Besides, he's not even
the subject to
looking.
me.
He's not looking for someone to just say, hey, I believe. Even demons believe. He's looking for people who will be followers, who will say, I buy into your
All right,
program.
that actually answers a really important question as I take it. Because really the only question I'm sort of interested in this particular topic is whether or not we have compelling historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And I take it that you're acknowledging that it could be much better than it was, and surely an omnipotent God could have done that, but he didn't.
Yeah.
And that strikes me as being a bizarre sort of, the internal logic of that seems to be really, really strange. And surely in that kind of circumstance, folks who maintain a view like yours can't say that the rest of us are thereby being unreasonable if we're not convinced.
Well, I would say, look at what he did. If
Well,
Christianity
why is
is
God
true,
underperforming so badly
I
in this
think he
case?
is. I like the way he does perform. He takes 12 knuckleheads in a dusty, remote region of the Roman Empire, and from that, a whole third of the world today claim to be Christian. That's pretty good.
Do you think God could have made Jesus' resurrection more abundantly clear and manifest to everyone then and now than
Yeah.
it currently is?
I do.
Why didn't he?
I don't know. I don't have to know. But it doesn't.
And
it
would
doesn't
you
mean
acknowledge that
that.
it looks a lot like these other natural religions and lots of
Oh, no,
important sort
not
of
at
general.
all. You mentioned some things like you said. The miracles for Muhammad are as well attested. Which ones do you have in mind?
I don't think they're as well attested. I think it's very easy to go find enthusiastic adherents who will construct very elaborate, very compelling sounding rationalizations for why those miracles are true and why these miracles are true. And we can find all of these folks for whom these different miracle accounts are incompatible, yet they all maintain that we've got sufficient evidence to show more or less what you're saying about a difference of incompatible miracles and a different kind of incompatible theism.
Actually, we don't, because Muhammad didn't perform miracles. The only miracle that is even attributed to him by Islam is the writing of the Quran, because they said he was illiterate. So I think you're mistaken on the history of Islam there. And then when it comes to miracles, they're not as well attested in other religions as we have for Christianity. The miracles of Jesus, we have are reported, let's say Mark, that's 35 to 40 years later. When you look at other stuff, like Apollonius of Tyana, that's like 125 plus years later. It's only reported by one source. You've got Josephus reporting about Hananiah Mendoza, or another one, the circle drawer. And that is like, I think Josephus is 125 years after. The next source is the Babylonian Talmud, which is hundreds, like 600 years later after the alleged event. We don't have anything close to the evidence for miracles in other religions as we have for Jesus.
We're actually to our second marker through the 10-minute mark. Let me give each of you a chance to ask one more question of each other before we open things up to the floor. Maybe just a 2-minute question for each of you.
Yeah, there's something I'd like to address that was in the book, that his book, because he's a lot more, I should say, sarcastically against Christianity than he was here. And he said how the more education you have, the less religious belief you have. And it was interesting you appealed to the Phil papers on that, because they only got results back from less than 1,000 people. And it was from 99 institutions, 96 of which was secular. So it seems like it was kind of fixed from the very beginning. But you know, there's Elaine Akun at Rice University, and she did a study with over 1,600 scientists with the American Academy of the Advancement of Science, the largest academy of its kind in the world. And she found that academic scientists they would develop their worldview in their adolescent years, and even before that, and certainly before they chose their career path. And they maintained those even after they became a scientist. So the bottom line there is they showed that it wasn't getting educated and receiving graduate and doctoral work that changes the view. They didn't change the view because of their education. They had it before they even got an education. So I think it's a misnomer to say that the more education you get, the less religious beliefs you have. And even in spite of that, you got...
Well, I didn't hear your question, but there's really good evidence here
How do you explain that?
from the Pew study research, for instance.
Yeah.
They've got thousands of subjects, not just scientists, but pretty reliable, as I understand it, reliable
51%
polling
are
data
theists, right?
in the Pew religious survey studies in recent years that show an inverse correlation between education and religiousness. The way in which I think this is pertinent to the discussion we're having today is that I think it's very easy to project sort of modern sensibilities and modern ideas onto the people we've been talking about, Paul and Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John and the like. But the same point goes across time as well as it does across society. So in first century Palestine, what levels of education, Mike mentioned 10% literacy rate, what levels of knowledge and information about the way objects and phenomena work in the world would those folks have? And that lends itself to my general point about their receptivity and their responsiveness to supernatural ideas as explanations for phenomena that's otherwise mysterious to them. So I think we have good evidence that education and religiousness are inversely related, and that projects back into time and tells us something about the folks who are telling us these
Matt,
stories.
you've got your chance at another 2-minute comment or question.
No, I'm actually good. We can talk.
Well, then we've got two people, Peter and Logan, who I think are going to take the
Can I just say something in response
Yeah,
to that?
that's fine. We're going to be getting the mics out
Didn't
anyhow.
have much in it.
So, yeah, the Pew research revealed that 51% of scientists and academics today, scholars, PhDs, believe that God exists and he acts in the world. Only 41% are atheists and agnostics. Another report put out by Tobin and Weinberg, two Jewish researchers in 2007, they interviewed about 1,300 professors in around 700 secular American universities, and they found that those who, so we're talking PhDs in all these universities in the US, and they found that the number of theists versus atheists and agnostics, that theists outnumber them 3-to-1. So even if you want to say that there's an inverse there, that the more education you get, the less religious beliefs you have, we still outnumber you 3-to-1. How do you like them apples?
Well, what's making you think about numbers? I've got no doubt I'm outnumbered.
This guy, I think in the corner, has been patiently waiting since like minute 1 of our questions. I'm not sure who you are, but thanks for waiting.
I'm Rick.
Oh yeah, let's give him a mic.
Got a thing here that works. Okay. I don't remember who said it first, but about the, the different levels of death, and you use the word certifiably dead, which doesn't mean anything.
Who are you talking to? Me or?
I'm talking to the obviously the religious guy on to your right. He's on your right, isn't he? Yeah.
They're both religious guys.
Anyway, but you said certifiably dead, which doesn't actually mean anything, and it's interesting to note that even presuming metabolic death, complete metabolic death, whatever that means. There was a study that I read recently from Science Daily where they did a study and they said that genes are active in the cells. Not all of the cells die until 72 hours after. So there is, some form of pseudo-neural activity that's occurring well after death, even McCormick death. So there is a small ray of hope for your case in the religious sense. However, you're not providing any real evidence as far as the corroboration, because you mentioned that the doctors corroborated things. They weren't in that person's house. They can't corroborate that story. And I know Matthew Alper wrote this great book called The God Part of the Brain, which I wish was more studied and more criticized, that goes into the fact where they can simulate the out-of-body experiences quite easily with like magnetoresonance or whatever. So I mean, there is a naturalistic explanation for this, and if the human mind does work, there is a good chance that you will know what your family is wearing on a given day if you know their styles, or they might not remember, so they're more willing to backtrack and rewrite over their own memories just to say that, oh my God, she really was there, she really saw it, just because we want to believe in something that's really amazing.
Who do you prefer a response from on this?
That's a good question. I'll take a response from either. Probably both. Let's hear both.
Let me respond to that, since that's directly what I said. What you said still doesn't. You talk about hope. I think that you're showing that you're hoping there for a naturalistic explanation, because even if there was some residual genetic activity within cells, that is no evidence. You have no evidence whatsoever that it's enough to show that they can hear things, they can see things that are going on, especially when their eyes are closed. So it would be your responsibility to show that that is possible, and possible is not probable.
It's your responsibility, because you're the one that's claiming they can do that.
Well, if they have no heartbeat, if they have no brain activity, to say that they got residual genetic activity in their cells, I think you're going to have to show that that is sufficient. Second, I would say that it doesn't account for the details, some of those details that can be corroborated. How do you say she knew what they were wearing, she knew what her mom was cooking, she knew what her dad was doing, she knew the song that was being sung, she knew the toys that were being played, and she gets it all right? There's a story of Pamela Reynolds, who had a brain surgery, I think it was in Texas, and a prominent cardiologist in Atlanta went and interviewed her, interviewed all the attending physicians involved. She was actually put out, her heart was stopped, the blood was drained out of her heart and brain. They opened up her skull, they did brain surgery, they had to lower the temperature of her body, I think to some, like 60-some degrees. While she was dead, she had her eyes taped shut, she had stuff put in her ears so that she couldn't hear. Then they had this machine hooked up to her that had this like tapping going on that would have been quite deafening had it not been for this stuff. But that would be to show that she was not feeling any pain or had any consciousness, because any kind of consciousness whatsoever would have showed up in the machine that was monitoring her here. She claims that while she was brain dead, she came out of her body, she's able to repeat discussions that the attending physicians had about her anatomy. She said that she floated behind a curtain and was able to report the kind of surgical tools that they used on her, which the physicians later reported they're created for this particular kind of surgery, and they're not the kind of things that you would imagine. So all these things were going, they were corroborated by the physicians who were there. So these things are just inexplicable to say that there's some residual genetic activity that was going on.
You may have noticed that I don't have a magic buzzer here like presidential debates, so I'll just kind of be noticing who else has their hand up. And so we've got several questions. We'll try to get to each of you. Why don't you-
Hi, so my name is Huda, and this question is directed for Dr. Mike Lacona. That's right. So if God gave the kind of evidence that he did, which you admit that could have been better, but you say it doesn't need to be, about the resurrection of Jesus to look for followers, as you say, then why would he give us as humans the mental capacities to reason against it and yet expect us to deny those capacities and rely on anecdotal authority?
That's a fair question. Let me turn that around and say, we could ask the same question and say, why are there Holocaust deniers? Why are there people who deny that Jesus ever existed when it's only like 7, according to Richard Carrier, the leading proponent of that view, there's only 7 scholars in the entire universe who hold that view. And say, okay, well, God, if Jesus really existed, why didn't you give people, why didn't you give more evidence so that people using their rational skills would be convinced? And you could say that to Holocaust deniers, you could say it to Jesus mythers, and say, well, maybe your burden of proof is just too high. And I would say that regarding the resurrection. And this afternoon's discussion does the historical evidence justify belief in Jesus' resurrection? So we could say, you could say, well, I want more before I believe. Okay, if you want more, that's fine. But the question is there enough to justify belief? And when you look at historical method and how you justify historical descriptions, you follow that method, and there's certainly enough evidence, historical evidence, to justify belief.
Yeah, that's good.
That's really interesting. I think in other ordinary circumstances, all of that would make a lot of sense. But the wrench that gets thrown in the gears here is that part of the hypothesis that we're being presented with is that the all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe is responsible for this body of merely sufficient historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And the real question is whether or not the evidence makes it compelling or makes it reasonable to believe. The evidence for the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe would be, by hypothesis, much more robust and would be vastly more compelling than the evidence that looks like one of these other natural religions. I mean, I think under ordinary historical circumstances, Mike's making a bunch of really great points about our method for evaluating historical information, and he's absolutely right about this is the way we draw conclusions about Caesar crossing the Rubicon and the like. But what the particular claim we're wondering about now is not about crossing the Rubicon. We're asking about a supernatural event, and a supernatural event that's alleged to be authored by an omnipotent being. And suddenly now we've got this question, well, why isn't God bowling 300 on this one? Why is he underperforming so poorly when he'd clearly be capable of doing so much more?
Thank you for passing on your follow-up. I'm probably going to want to institute a pattern of no follow-ups from the same audience member until we have everybody get their first crack at it. Who wants one?
Thank you both for your presentations. My question is for Dr. McCormick. And it kind of relates to what you were just discussing, but Mike's response to you on the evidence, or the degree of the evidence, if you will, was, well, gee, there's 1 billion Christians in the world today. It amounted to something. And what struck me toward the end of your presentation, I think you may have fallen into your defense lawyer thing that you warned us against, because you threw up 500 gods. It was a little small print. I couldn't see them all. But I suspect that you could probably put all the adherents to those gods in a room today. So does that trouble you that there's a comparative there, that, you know, one set of evidence has produced 1 billion people, while the other evidences, which were obviously false or demonic, have gone away?
No,
does that trouble you?
You're absolutely right. That Christianity is a vast global movement, and it has hundreds of millions of adherents. Viewed from one perspective, that looks like a problem for me, I think, is what you're getting at. Because how would so many people be off base here? Now, I think I find issue with your suggestion that the bulk of those people, or all those people, conducted the sort of historical investigation that Mike's engaged in, and as a result of their inquiry, then drew this conclusion on the basis of the historical evidence. I think when you go poll or talk to people who are self-professed Christian believers, the bulk of them won't say, "Oh, I believe because of compelling historical evidence in favor." Lots of people are making these arguments, scholars are making these arguments out there, but I don't think the bulk of them actually do that. I see it more as admittedly, a vast, powerful social, political, cultural movement, and it's got a lot of traction. As has Islam, as has Buddhism, as has Hinduism, and human history is full of failed religious movements, and we've got some big winners these days. And for those of us who find ourselves living in this environment, we've got to draw a reasonable conclusion about, well, what should I make of all of these believers around me who find this so compelling? So it's a great question.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Lycona. Did I say it right? Yeah. You were discussing about evidence for the historical resurrection of Jesus. And one of your evidence was the Gospels. And even through your slides, you said out of the 4 Gospels, 2 of them you give a little bit more credit to than the other 2. And then, of course, Dr. McCormick comes on and he explains, and from what I've read before, is the dates that these were written are way, way after the alleged incident. And even then, they're just copies and copies of the original. So we're talking, I believe, almost 200 years after. So how do you wrap your head around that, not from a religious perspective, but from an evidence perspective, to say this is enough to show that this happened?
Yeah, good questions. So I would say, first of all, that the Gospel of John, probably the latest gospel to be written, it's about the same distance as, say, interviewing a World War II veteran right now. Okay? Now, History Channel does it all the time. If they were there, they were eyewitnesses, we look at that and say, great, no problem. And that's John. If we're looking at Mark, then we're looking at more like closer than Vietnam, actually. A couple years after the Vietnam War, from that point until today, is what you're looking at for the Gospel of Mark, and maybe even earlier than that. When it comes to the copies and copies of copies, well, we've got between 9 and 15 manuscripts that are dated within 5 to 150 years of the originals. It's pretty good. And we have 5,839 Greek manuscripts. That's what the New Testament was originally written in. 5,839 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. The closest second place is the Homeric epics. And you have just under 2,000 of those, and the earliest was written about 500 years later. If you're looking at Plutarch, much of what we know about the past was written by Plutarch. You're looking at, for the fall of the Roman Republic, you're looking at maybe 50 manuscripts, period, from Plutarch. And the earliest was written about 800, 900 years later. So what we have for the New Testament is just amazing in terms of the quality of evidence, for the manuscript evidence. And even Bart Ehrman, he's a friend of mine, he's an atheist, New Testament scholar. We've debated 5 times. I like the guy, we get along really well. And Ehrman has said that of all the discrepancies we have between the manuscripts, and there are tons of them, none of them impact any essential Christian doctrine, and that scholars today regard the New Testament, the Greek text that we have in the New Testament, as virtually 100% of what the originals actually said.
I think there's 2 people up here. Oh, sorry. This is also for Dr. Lycona. Earlier you talked about why give us more when we haven't believed based on what we've already gotten. And you used example from stock trading, and as someone who has taken a bit of basic economics, I admit I'm not an economics major, but God doesn't have to deal with a certain element that humans do have to deal with, which is scarcity. He doesn't have to limit himself. There's no
need for him to limit himself. He's infinite. Am I incorrect in saying that?
No, I think he's infinite. Yeah.
So,
I can't prove that.
in
But-
that sense, why, if he doesn't have the need to reduce what he has to do because he doesn't have the scarcity issue that we as humans have, which is limited resources and limited, the personal case that you used, money, why not maybe just put some inexplicable thing down on the ground for us so that we knew that there is stuff that we cannot explain? It wouldn't have been hard. It would have been like
No.
swatting a fly for us.
I think that's a fair question, kind of like hers, fair question she asked. And, you know, I don't know why he didn't give us more. That doesn't mean we're not justified in believing, based on the historical evidence, that Jesus rose from the dead. It just means I can't answer why God would have acted the way he did. I've been married for over 29 years, and I can tell you, living with my wife virtually every day, there's a lot of things that she does that I don't understand why she does them. And if I can't understand my wife after 30 years, I'm not surprised if I don't understand why the creator of the universe doesn't do things the way I want him to at times.
Dr. Lacuna, but I'd like to hear Dr. McCormick's answer too. But primarily, regarding all the paranormal, out-of-body, near-death experience, all of that, are you, back up, the sun used to be a paranormal a supernatural experience. Human impregnation used to be a supernatural, unexplained, treated as a supernatural. Disease, floods, and famine, and all that was attributed to gods. Supernatural, we didn't understand it. We now know, we have evidence. We understand modern science has explained them. Are you willing to accept that perhaps all of those apparitions and all of those experiences actually happen? The accounts are real, but perhaps there is, as yet, an unfound natural explanation. Science hasn't found it yet, but perhaps apparitions are real. Perhaps out-of-body experiences are entirely factual. How do you know they're supernatural? How do you not know they are actually natural? We just haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, fair question. I would say I have to be open to the possibility that science will discover some way in the future to explain those, not only explain those in natural terms, but also show that that's the preferable explanation rather than a priori presupposing naturalism. But I would say based on our current scientific knowledge right now, it's what we do know about science that renders them as supernatural events and not natural.
Did you want to respond to this question too?
I lost my thoughts. I won't.
We've got some people over here, I think. So, okay.
Just to help clarify the lady's comment or question, people believe in Plato and Socrates. Plato's documents were 12 writings, I believe, and they were written, the closest copy they have is 300 years old. Socrates, I think, is 700 years old or 1,000.
Are you asking McCormick this question, or?
That was just a statement.
I have
Okay.
a response if you have a
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I want to emphasize this point again. You're absolutely right, and Mike's made some good points about how we've got historical evidence, sometimes thin, sometimes sketchy historical evidence from what appears to be pure sources for some events that presumably we'll all take to be transparent, obvious, and we take it to be historically corroborated. I want to make a really sharp distinction between when ancient peoples report things like invasions or battles or who's Caesar, or what did Caesar do,
Crucifixions.
or when Lincoln got shot or what have you, when they make natural claims versus when they make supernatural claims. And I think you all are already with me on this, that we're some World War II vet to tell us a story about watching somebody miraculously revived from the dead on the battlefield. We wouldn't take that as seriously as perhaps some of the other claims. I'm skeptical about magical claims when they come from ancient people. And I think for good reason. So we got to separate those two, and it's not merely a matter of this conflation. It's not merely a matter of establishing that some ancient person believed something and they wrote it down. I might even be prepared to grant that. Somebody believed, Paul evidently believed, that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not contesting that at all. And I'm not contesting that lots and lots of people believe all kinds of weird magical things. And I think first century people believed even more of them. But we can't simply read that off for face value and go, he believed it, therefore it must have actually happened. And I hear that slip, that conflation happen a lot, where we move from so-and-so said it, it's been historically corroborated that they said it, to therefore it happened. Well, that works for crossing rivers. But none of us take that to be obviously the case for magical claims.
Yeah.
And I'll just throw the Salem witch trials point out there, right? We've got a mountain of evidence about so-called eyewitness testimony about real magic and real witchcraft in Salem in the 1600s. We've actually got the documents. And you all don't probably, although I got to find out, triangulate, depending on who I'm talking to, you probably don't think that the magic was real there. But the evidence is much better there for thinking that magic was happening there than happening in Jerusalem. So I'm just trying to illustrate this point that magic is a different kind of claim.
Actually, I don't agree that the evidence is better for the supernatural element in the Salem witch trials than for the resurrection. Because you don't have a lot of these, you've got some cases here where the naturalistic explanations do kick in and can better explain some of those phenomena, like they were allowing spectral evidence. So if a person just said, hey, I see a ghost, a spirit next to that person, then they admitted that as evidence. And apart from that, no one would have been killed at the Salem witch trials. I also say that by going by that, you say, we got all this good evidence at the Salem witch trial thing, and we reject the supernatural element, even though with all this evidence. Well, you know, for Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, we only have, I think it's less than half a dozen sources written within 2 centuries of the event itself. So given that, we should reject Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, because the evidence is better for the Salem witch trials and the supernatural elements than we have for Caesar's crossing the Rubicon.
Caesar is purported to have performed many magical feats. One of the other things that those sources that Mike's referring to is that lots of people at the time thought that Caesar had magical powers.
One other
Don't
thing.
take those
Where
to
do
be
you get that
face
from?
value.
I think
Where do you
people.
get that from?
Well, there are lots
I
of,
read the ancient sources on this. So where do you get that from?
I can dig it up.
Tell me one of the miracles that he's alleged to have done.
I'll have to dig it up. I don't have, it's just.
Can I finish real quick?
I've got 2 small problems. One is that we've got 2 minutes left of our scheduled event time. And then the second is you haven't really gotten to ask the question you wanted to ask because of that introductory comment about Plato. So why don't you fire it off real quick, and that'll be...
Okay, well, it's just, there's 44 authors in the Bible. And there was, the comments that were made in the New Testament, they were never contradicted because he did them at the very same time that Paul saw, or the authors of the Gospels saw what happened. People who saw Christ die, people who saw or were during that time never...
Mark and Luke were not eyewitnesses, so they didn't
No.
see it, but they got
Right.
their information from eyewitnesses. Do you have a question? Because we're limited on time here. You got to go real quick.
Okay, well, no, there's 60 books. They all agree. The Bible, people get confused with the Bible because they think it's just one book, but it's 44 authors and 66 books that agree on the same thing.
Well, listen, thank you for your comment, and I am going to actually wrap up our event in terms of its formal time. You're welcome to stay here and chat with people in the room if the people you want to chat to prefer to stay around. We only have this room until 6:30, so it's like 30 more minutes. I'd like you to go ahead and join me in thanking both of our speakers for today's event.